Now we're going to briefly discuss demand pull inflation. In the last video, we saw how monetary policy can correct for when an economy is moving into a recession. For instance, we've got aggregate supply, we've got aggregate demand, and we have potential GDP or long run aggregate supply, as we've said in previous videos. So assume the economy, for some reason, consumer confidence falls or some negative shock to aggregate demand. Well, what this does then is this brings the economy below potential. Unemployment rises, and the Federal Reserve can then perform, as we saw in previous videos, can perform an open market purchase of government securities, and that will increase the money supply and shift the aggregate demand curve back to the right, okay, avoiding a recession. But sometimes the Federal Reserve isn't very careful about when they stop increasing the money supply. Okay, so let's assume that the Fed has corrected the economy, but for some reason information they've acquired is lagged several periods, and they don't know that the economy is back at potential yet. Okay, so that's aggregate demand. This is short run aggregate supply, and that is potential. So this is after the correction. The Federal Reserve has increased the money supply and they've corrected. But what if the Federal Reserve doesn't know that the economy is actually back at potential where they want it to be? So they continue to increase the money supply. Well, this will increase aggregate demand. Okay, and then what we end up with is an inflationary gap. Now, an inflationary gap is simply where prices rise mostly due to an increase in aggregate demand. Okay, it can occur with a decrease in aggregate supply in the short run. Mostly we see an inflationary gap occur with an increase in aggregate demand. So now we have an inflationary gap that drives unemployment down because now we're operating above potential, and since unemployment is so low, employees can command higher wages. That shifts the aggregate supply curve back to the left. Okay, now assume that the money supply keeps growing. Okay, so the Fed doesn't, they're getting lagged information, say here. They haven't yet gotten the true numbers for what's been happening in the economy, so they're just continuing to grow the money supply. You would get another shift rightward in aggregate demand. Wages would go up again. You would get a leftward shift in aggregate supply due to an increase in wages. Okay, ultimately what you have happen is this cycle just keeps going. Okay, so if the Fed doesn't put the brakes on an increase in the money supply, you continue to have this rightward shift in aggregate demand, you continue to have a leftward shift in aggregate supply. The economy keeps, right around its potential state. But the key thing here is, look what happened to the general price level. Now, we've discussed this before when we were looking at the equation of exchange, right? That an increase in the money supply by 10% results in a 10% increase in prices, and here's how we see it, okay? And in fact, this can actually escalate beyond what we actually find in the equation of exchange, especially in the short run. We can actually see prices rise at a greater rate than the money supply rises, and it all just depends on how quickly that aggregate supply curve keeps shifting back to the left. Okay, so this is called demand pull inflation. Why is it called demand pull inflation? Because the Federal Reserve interaction with this market keeps demand shifting rightwards, which pulls prices up. Demand pull inflation.